let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's nothing to it. Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's nothing to it. Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's nothing to it. Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's
How's it going, everyone? So in this tutorial, I thought I'd kind of follow up on the last one I did on MoGrab, but this time with a slightly more creative project file. So within this project file, there's a lot of interesting techniques and effects and stuff that I've applied quite creatively and discovered a lot through experimentation. So as you will have heard in the intro, the style is quite similar, and I'd probably say it's more on like the rave break side of things than the last one, but it kind of follows quite a similar style, quite diverse as well. There's a lot of influence from different styles and that kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of what we're gonna look at in this one, kind of like a general overview. Before we start, all the resources that I mentioned throughout will be linked below, including like the sample pack and stuff. So if you're interested, you can check them out. There is a free version as well for anyone. So yeah, let's just get into it then. To start with, we have the vocals. So I'll start with the second vocal.
don't just stand.
I'll just start with both of them actually.
Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's nothing to it. Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's nothing to it. Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's nothing to it. Don't just stand there, let's get to it.
So the kind of vocal I started off with, I normally kind of like get quite creative with these, and I feel like when I'm doing these artist style tutorials, there's like any kind of vocal, there's kind of like no set direction essentially. Any kind of vocal will work. So I kind of found this. I'll go to the break, and then if I've chopped it up a lot. If I just duplicate this is kind of what I started with. I'll take the filter off as well. There's basically so there's like quite a good place for vocals and samples in general called Breakbeat Paradise. I think I've mentioned it before. So I basically found this kind of ravey vocal, if you will, like and what I've essentially done to get that kind of like ghetto texture, I'm pretty sure I've described it before in like the Ketama vocal tutorial I did. I've basically pitched it up using the sound shifter plugin. I've pitched it up 4 semitones. It's like a really harsh texture. The Ketama vocal tutorial I did, I went into a lot of detail on like that kind of texture, like with like the raw cuts and stuff. It's like a similar kind of thing. And basically what I've done is chopped it a lot. Because I didn't like the last section of that. So I've taken like phrases and like I've basically like duplicated, which has like a really nice rhythmic texture. And this one here, you'll see down here. Oh no, I've basically played around with the pitching as well of different syllables. I'll re-enable this. So here, so basically here is up 4 semitones, and then the second part is down, or is normal. Really like that kind of texture. It like works really well for the drums. As like drum fills and stuff. And like in terms of like the effects, you've obviously got this pitch thing here. EQ, it's been compressed, which I would normally do to vocals. I have the filter that basically is automating up to open it up. And there's like reverbs and delays. There's basically like your kind of standard effects. And then I was speaking of the Ketama tutorial, where I also used erosion and overdrive to get that harsh vocal. I'll take that off again. I'll do it on the drop. It basically adds texture in these kind of plugins, and this kind of brings out the upper harmonics. So that's kind of like that plugin, that channel. That's kind of like the main vocal I had. But then I mentioned I like to get like creative with like vocals and stuff, even if they're not directly related to the artist. Just you might as well have fun with like creating projects. So I kind of got this Madonna vocal, and I think the way I ended up like choosing this was I basically wanted I basically looked up like these kind of lyrics, don't just stand or don't you stand or whatever, basically whatever you hear from this phrase. Basically like there's loads of like potential things you can hear from these muffled vocals, like hold your stance and don't just something like that. They're, to me, they're just the things that I hear. I think I ended up googling those kind of lyrics or putting them into the search bar just to kind of see what I could come with, like basically see what I could find. And
don't just stand, let's get to it.
So I think I ended up going for like don't just stand.
Don't just stand, let's get to it.
And I basically used that as like a fill.
Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's nothing to it.
This Madonna song. And then I did the kind of like same like duplicate trick.
Don't just stand, let's get to it.
Don't just stand, let's get to it. Don't just stand, let's get to it.
And I also pitched it.
Don't just stand, let's get to it.
There's nothing really like special on the effects as well.
Don't just stand, let's get to it. Don't just stand, let's get to it.
But I've basically pitched it so it works. And I'm mostly using it as like a vocal fill. But here in like the breakdown, I like to have like the full phrase before simplifying it.
Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's nothing to it. Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's nothing to it. Don't just stand there, let's get to it.
You get the point in that. But then like this kind of bit, it kind of works off each other.
Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's... Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's...
I'm trying to think of where it is. I think it's here.
Strike a pose, there's nothing to it. Strike a pose. Don't just stand there, let's get to it. Strike a pose, there's nothing. Don't just stand there, let's get to it.
Basically, like, you can have two different vocals and they both kind of like, they sound quite close to one another. both in terms of key and the lyrics. You can basically have like,
Don't just stand, let's get to it.
you can basically have that as a fill then, and then you can have that as a fill 8 bars later. So it's kind of like a nice little vocal technique. You can use like multiple vocals. You can slice them to your heart's desire. And use like interesting effects that you wouldn't normally consider on them, and basically chop them up so much, pitch them, that kind of thing. Kind of things I associate with a lot of like rave records and stuff. Next we have the kick, and I've kind of done, I'll find, okay, yeah, this is good. So here, we basically have, this is the kick. I mentioned in the last one that a lot of it's about like sample choice and stuff. So I've taken a lot of these samples from the Mograb sample pack I created, because I created them specifically for that vibe. But just to recap, you can essentially take like drums from different drum machines and run them through like a lot of distortion, saturation, that kind of thing, to get these kind of samples. If not, you can check out the pack, which will be linked below, where I've done that work for you. But essentially, these samples are already pretty heavy. As you'll see, this one has like nice upper harmonics as well. I've EQ'd them and I've added that extra drum bus just for extra distortion really. And I've used parallel compression on it. So that's in terms of the effects. And in terms of like some interesting stuff, the actual pattern just varies so much across the kind of rough arrangement I've done. So that's kind of like the rough loop. You'll see some notes have been shortened, and got like variations, with regards to fills. This is something I've done across the whole drums a lot. It's like kind of taking sections out to bring them back in, which is a really interesting like arrangement trick in itself. So I've done something different to keep things interesting. And that's the only time I've done that route really, actually. But you can get pretty creative. You'll see here there's like gaps where I've basically taken stuff out, and we'll get onto that more with the breaks. But yeah, it's basically a really good thing you can do every like 8 bars or so. Basically take something out or add effects or something to switch up and keep the arrangement interesting. And then here, for a more impactful drop, we've got like a reverse, which is high passed at the time. So that is the kick. For the drums, I'll come back to the group. We have the snare claps, which are basically playing on the 2 and the 4 as is kind of standard. No variation of thing or anything. Processing the clap sounds like this. I've low passed, but barely makes a difference. And this is also a very saturated clap, which has all been layered with this. which is basically like similar to how I've done the kick. I've basically taken already processed samples. I might do a separate drum tutorial, which starts from like more clean samples, trying to get that sound. But like I said, I created them for the specific purpose of kind of like getting close to that sound, so might as well use them, you know. And then on the group, we've kind of done extra enhancement. We've done low end cuts, and then we've done saturation. And we've basically taken the audio down because adding drive, we don't want to make it just dynamic, the change. We want to actually be able to hear it. It's very subtle. And there's some reverb on that, which makes it so you get like a really layering, basically gives like a really impactful snare clap pattern, which works really well with the kick as well as like a breakbeat, kind of like the foundation of breakbeat really. That's that. For these, we have kind of like, I spoke of this before, like in the last one, like basically a lot of Mulgrab's tracks have energy, lack of a better kind of term, and a lot of that comes from the high end. So got this open hat, which is nothing special really. Got this open hat, and then you have closed hat. Got shakers, and you have crashes. All together sounding like this. With different like variations and stuff. So basically I spoke of like you kind of want like loads of like patterns that complement each other but don't clash. And you can like thankful like with this kind of pattern I would normally go open hat, 16th note shaker or that kind of thing, crash as like an effect in this case, and then one other one, which you can get pretty creative with. Like that's that's pretty standard. And this is pretty standard as well. It's like 16ths. But like where the creative, this is like quite a creative option because you've basically got, I turn off the effects. It's nearly a 16th pattern, but you can essentially, you can either do it manually or you can draw in 16ths and basically just take out like notes and set gaps. And then once you add the main open hat, you'll hear it work really well. And you'll see here a lot of these gaps are actually where the open hat comes in. As you'll see, it works. You're basically filling where the open hat doesn't play, so they're bouncing off one another, if you get me. And then something I've done just so they don't crash in the odd instance where they play together. I've sidechained the open hat. It sounds a bit too straight and robotic. That kind of like gives it bounce. It bounces off that hat. And then mentioned some creative things you can be doing, because they're all operating at the same kind of frequency, so it can get quite boring. But to add some movement, you can essentially do this and add phaser. And kind of set where you want it here, and you can basically, what I like to do with like most effects, like filters, modulation, is add an LFO of some kind. In the most extreme example, the LFO is essentially moving this around. I'm pretty sure it basically modulates the effect you're doing. So any Ableton effect that has this, you can essentially program the amount it moves and how fast, and get pretty creative with it. And it basically like draws your attention to something that's a bit more interesting than just your static. Basically keeps it interesting. I would always look at to do that kind of thing on like kind of like your standard elements that could be quite repetitive, basically. So that is, oh yeah, and last but not least, we basically have like a crash, which kind of works well as a nice transitional element. As you'll see, and it's got like loads of reverbs and stuff. Moving on, we have the perks. Don't think there's many. I think it's kind of like a similar yeah, I've basically taken like random hits and like spread them out quite sparse. That's kind of like a bleepy LFO. And a ring modulation type perk. You'll never guess where they're from. Back. And we have basically some like, they're quite like abstract percussion textures, but they work quite well in this example, just like spread out. I don't think there's like an over-reliance on perk in this particular genre, but it's quite good to add them in to kind of keep things a bit interesting. Like ear candy, essentially. And most of them have like echo or some kind of like delay effect on them. Yeah, it's not really much to like. The group has echo on as well. That basically, they're kind of like sparse, and they basically kind of make it more interesting, essentially. And finally, probably the bit that's basically making this loop what it is these. So we have. Let's just go to the busiest part. We'll loop here. So I mentioned about hats basically having multiple patterns, and something I like to have is like a texture loop, which is essentially playing the same kind of like rhythm. It's like a hat width, so this is like a 16th. But then but essentially like not a hat, so like a perk or just anything, literally anything. Playing the same kind of rhythms. So this is like a straight 16th. And something I like to do, which I didn't do, well, I did on the shaker, on like repetitive elements, is you can essentially either, you can manually do like the velocity, but you can also use, where is it? You can also use like random reset on the velocity program and alter this. And you can like change what it randomizes and stuff. So I've brought the sustain down on this. I found like a point. You'll hear like literally when I scan through, there's all sorts of different potential here, like. And then I've EQ'd it. So that's number 1 on the loops. Then I start to go into like break territory. So I basically chopped the Bobby Bird's Hot Pants break, which is a pretty common break. I've got that one. Got a variation of the Amen, which is another popular break. Basically the key is like kind of finding like breaks that work and warping them in time and essentially chopping them. Got this break. In terms of processing, there's not really much on these, by the way. But I've got this one here. And I'll take this effect off. It's basically, it's the same, but it's being run through 100% this plugin here, which is, I'm pretty sure it's a free plugin called MComb by Melda Production, and you can essentially basically put something called comb filtering, which I'll explain more on this, but it basically relies on like the delay effect, and you're basically cranking the feedback up to basically loop the sound into itself and get that kind of like high-pitched texture. It'll make more sense when I talk about it on the loop, but this plugin basically is that effect. And I found this preset, which essentially, basically like, I don't know where I've heard it before, but I feel like it's definitely a common sound in like rave records and stuff. So I've basically, I don't think the automation's anything special. So yeah, I've basically added that effect, which works really well when it's blended with a dry version. I think it's an effect that produces special effects. Special Request uses quite a lot. And then on that break side, you basically just got breaks that have been like chopped up to use as fills. if I just play them all, like. I mentioned about like leaving gaps, but pretty much every 8 bars I've got some kind of variation here. Perhaps too many variations, but it's actually all to taste really. But it kind of works well, like to kind of break things up and keep you interested essentially. As well as like helping to transition into like other sections. Like I mentioned like the crash. So finally, I mentioned the comb filter effect. So I had that comb filter effect on the break. But then I also put it on the loop group. And I essentially, where is it? Basically automated the dry wet to come up at the end of the bar. And if I just delete this, essentially how the comb filter effect works is you basically want a really short delay time. Now we're getting into the good stuff. Essentially you basically want a short delay time. You'll hear that kind of like pitch effect taking place. You'll want to crank the feedback up to somewhere like 70% minimum. And then the dry wet is to taste. I've alternated between 0 and 100, but you could keep it on 100. And then basically like the delay time is, you're basically using the delay time to affect the pitch and the kind of like tone and stuff. You'll see like when I move it around, like just how crazy it can get. And you can like do like mashup effects and stuff. This is like where the artist special request I was talking about kind of comes to mind. You can basically automate it up to like this. And then keep it short if you want to keep it on. So that is essentially the comb filter effect. And how to set it up. It's a really interesting technique to try on like drums and stuff. And basically use it to create textures and effects for yourself. So the way I've done it is I basically like ran a bunch of like breakbeat loops and those kind of loops, which already sound good. And then my personal choice, I've chose to keep it to the end of the bar to bring that effect in, but you could literally have it on for that kind of like rave style drum effect. So that is essentially the drums, which are essentially what makes this loop, I'd say. And then I'll briefly talk about these other little bits, because there's not really as much to talk about with them. I've got this bass. So most of it is literally like, the patterns are simple. I think I talked about this last time. Really simple, and you basically just have to choose the right sounds. Arguably I could have chose better sounds, to be fair, for this example, but I've used one of the bass presets, pitched up actually, and then I've layered it with like an operator. Sub. This is more subby. Then added like distortion. Because with sub elements, a lot of the time you need to boost them up in some way. Added the mono, saturation. I've got saturation on there, but I haven't actually saturated it. But that's where I'd be going. But basically, like, the idea is to kind of get crazy with distortion. I mentioned it with drums, but the same kind of applies with bass and even the synths. Adding saturation, I feel like it's a key kind of characteristic of his sound. And then finally, the synths. Kind of like that retro. I don't know how to describe it. Like, if you listen to a lot of his music, you kind of hear like a kind of distinct sound when it comes to like the leads. It's kind of like in this case, it's like plucky and arpeggiated. And I've just used Omnisphere, a plucky preset from it. This one, I don't think I've changed anything. You've got like this kind of like super saw. I feel like that's another common sound when it comes to like more grabs and synths. Trying to think what the song is. But the melody I've wrote, I don't remember what the song is, but the melody I've wrote is kind of similar to it. So if anyone knows, let me know. I think with this like super saw, I was thinking like counter melodies, because a lot of his like synths have like more than one melody going on. Got the main one, and then like a kind of like harmonic one. And I think with this, with like the sound design, there's like a plugin called Hive, and like the very first preset you open up on it might not work. It's like a really intense preset, but it's got like a reverb and stuff that I don't think you can remove easily. But I wanted that preset, but I think I just ended up like gonna recreate it. I'm getting relatively close, to be fair. With like super saw, which is basically like two two saw waves, and then detuned to opposite effect with loads of like vibrato and detunes, and then like lots of reverb and stuff. I don't want to like go into like massive amounts because you can literally like find super slow presets and stuff. It's quite a common like type of sound. But I basically just had that, and then I think I basically just layered it with EQ, compression, saturation. This is kind of what I was talking about, like EQ and compressor are like pretty common, especially like when layering. But saturation just kind of adds that kind of characteristic we want. That's that. And then we have this kind of additional thing that probably isn't needed, but I thought it sounded nice, so I kept it in. Kind of like an arpeggiated, like a chord stab. Filtered. Like, it's not needed, but it's a nice extra. And then finally, the least interesting thing. Like a kind of like pad which complements it. Basically we've like chosen carefully selected sounds and stuff that work. Got a loop, which is called Newcastle because I think I was trying to recreate Newcastle hardcore. And then you basically have this as well, just all together work. And yeah, that is essentially it. So that basically concludes the end of that one. I hope it kind of gave you like a more kind of creative insight into what might undergo throughout his process. One can only speculate really, but I feel like there's some techniques within this that are very similar to the sound he kind of achieves. So yeah, that's kind of it for like the overview tutorials. I'm possibly considering doing some like more in-depth ones, kind of like I've done previously, on like specific elements like drums, because within these ones I can only cover so much, and I tend to go longer than I would like, but I'm thinking of maybe doing some like specific ones that kind of cover those elements in more depth. Especially like the ones I touch over quite quickly, so be sure to let us know if you want to see them. And yeah, other than that, be sure to like and subscribe if you found it useful and want to see future videos. Comment with feedback or future suggestions, and if interested, all the resources will be linked down below as usual, so you can follow up with that if you want to. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.